Kerry Arquette is our speaker today. She has a master's degree in criminology and worked with a specialist with Denver Police Department. Written several books, written for many magazines. And she's going to talk about World War II ghosts. If you would please silence your cell phones. This would be good. And out of courtesy, please hold your questions until the end of the talk. So, this is Kerry Arquette.
Thank you. I can't believe you guys actually all came. Yay me, yay you. Let me tell you to begin with that this may not be an easy experience. It's not supposed to be an easy experience. It has to do with World War II. And so hold on to your seats. Things will have ups and downs emotionally, and we'll work our way through this together. Probably the biggest challenge is going to be the PowerPoint. We'll see how I do on that. I'd like to make it sing and dance. Fanny. There is a place a world away where a man may journey after his toils are through. Without the weight of guilt or blame or passion or pain, his soul rises like a leaf borne on the gentlest breeze. And as the earth falls away below, the air becomes clean and clear. Sounds fade to the whir of a hummingbird's wings. Odors of life and death dilute, then disappear. From this ethereal tower that dwarfs the tallest mountain peak, one can view the enormous mosaic of mankind, from time's conception to the clock's most recent tick. A man can find his soul space in this scheme, gaining perspective on his contribution to the rich and riotous whole. And there, you, will know if his life has been well-lived or wasted, and whether in the end he was hero or villain. That's the premise behind War Cries, that everybody, we are all the protagonists of our own story, right? We're all the good guys, and we all move our way through life with the highest intention based on the character that we came into this world as, our upbringing, other influences like religion, what's going on politically in our area. So that's a fairly easy premise for us at least to put out there. Something more difficult for me to ask you to try to understand is how War Cries came about. So here I am, daughter of a well-known writer, but I'm a mother in suburbia raising 3 kids. And in order to keep my brain from turning to mush, I would put the kids down for their naps or take them to an activity, and I would sit down at my computer and write anything at all. And I wrote, as Jerry said, for magazines. I wrote a few little children's books. And then one day something happened when I sat down at my computer. I started to hear a voice. This wasn't something that I was prone to, I promise. But it was something that I could not ignore. It was truly interesting to me. And then after this voice, which I took down the narration, other voices came. And they came, and they came, and they came, until there were 99 of them. And I did my best to listen and to write down the stories. And unlike when most of us write, and we're taught to edit and edit and edit and edit, these stories fell onto the pages and appeared in the book pretty much as they came to me. These were the stories of 99 people whose lives had ended or been altered forever because of World War II in Europe. I was not a historian, still am not a historian, was not raised Jewish, although my first memories when I was 2 were dying in the Holocaust, and I didn't know what the Holocaust was. raised in a Christianicious kind of a household where we celebrated Christmas trees and Santa, but pretty much had no religious upbringing. So to feel that kind of connection from the time I was young is very unusual, and we all just kind of accepted it. When the poems started coming from War Cries, I didn't know what to expect, and it really forced me to open up and to look at each of these individuals as that, as individuals. And I have to tell you, there were German soldiers who justified their actions in a way that I got it. There are children, there's resistance fighters, there's a Danish boat captain, there's old, there's young. They covered such a spectrum, and some of them are very unlikable until you understand where they were coming from. So I'm going to share some of these voices with you. I'm going to take you along for the ride that I got to experience, and we're going to learn something together. This first woman, Rivka, before I launch into Rivka, let me explain what this slide is. About halfway through this whole experience of creating War Cries, I started to create artwork, museum quality artwork that illustrated some of the poems. This is done with cloth and clay and charcoal and a fabric stiffener. Rivka is a young woman, and she was living in a small village. This is what she told me. When the SS came into the village and herded up the population, took them out into the forest, and there was a pit, and they were forced to strip, which was something that the Nazis did because naked people were less likely to run. And also it meant that the clothes could be distributed to good Germans. And this is Rivka's story. 16, underdeveloped and painfully shy, I was destined to die, if not from the SS bullet, then from shame. For there I stood at the pit's lip, stripped of shift, chemise, and stockings, with Clement's eyes upon me, and I knew that death couldn't come a moment too soon. Ladies, put yourselves back there, 16 years old. Nobody has ever seen you naked. And you're forced to strip in front of the boy that you have a crush on? She's so real that she was one of the first poems that brought me into this experience. I couldn't back away from her. And this is what the boy's response was. We'll take a minute and I'll let you read it yourself. Sometimes I received paired stories. Sometimes they stood alone. Oftentimes I was given stories of people and I did not have a clue of the history behind it. This is a young woman who actually grew through World War II and found her destiny in it rather than finding her demise through it. She was a German housewife, and she ended up becoming a night witch. Night witches were a group of German women who were conscripted, we can do this, to drive planes, bomber planes. And one of the techniques that they used was they would go over the villages where they were supposed to drop their bombs, and they would cut the engines. And the sound that those planes made flying over the villages and towns without engines sounded to the soldiers on the ground like witches on broomsticks. And so Marina was one of those fighters. And here's her story. A lovely little life in a lovely little house awaited me. There, warmed by hearth fire, slow molasses days would pass as simple verses flowed from my pen, and cloying proverbs in pastel from my thread. In that cottage quaint and calm, my love would find me waiting at day's end, with cheek at ready so his lips might press home the obligatory kiss. Then on into evening and on through dinner, trifling talk of this and that would fill the silence until bed beckoned. Resting by his side, serenaded by rolling snores, I would contemplate a woman's fate. How nicely ordered, how profitably full of church bazaars, book chats, coffee clatches, gentle gossip, adoring children, and grateful, dimming parents. A lovely little life in a lovely house awaited me. There, hips spreading, breasts sagging, mind bored numb, hair teched out up, eyes modestly cast down, I might have passed long, languishing years contentedly grounded in mundanity. But a woman whose heart has a machine gun cadence at talk of politics, intrigue, or battle was not created for hearth and home. Born with a banshee scream in my throat, I never questioned my destiny. For how much finer to die young in a blaze of glory for Mother Russia than to live and live and live and never live at all. Hans is a hard one to like. This is what he has to say. Like sheep to the slaughter, they watched their possessions being confiscated. They allowed themselves to be taken from their homes, and their homes taken from them. They docilely gave up their jobs and professions. They did nothing when their children were barred from school. They relocated with little protest. They moved from hell into hellholes and ghettos and overcrowded tenements. They sewed identifying stars on their clothes when instructed. They ceased to congregate for religious worship. They followed edicts disallowing them access to parks and public places. They let their cities be overrun and ruled by strangers. They resigned themselves to beatings and other humiliations. They watched their neighbors massacred. They dug pits, stepped in, and waited for the bullets. They complied when told to meet for deportation. They permitted their families to be separated. They boarded the trains. They walked to the gas chambers. They worked until they dropped, making war goods for their enemies, and they never, ever lifted a finger to save themselves. One of the areas of civilians that Hitler and his cronies targeted were artists, because they had an ability to catch the imaginations of the citizens and potentially could be real dangers having their ideals followed instead of the ideals of the Nazi Party. Sonia Grenling was a ballerina. She worked in Moscow. I went back and found her. I knew nothing about her. And this is her story. I lifted spirits and hearts with a body flexible as taffy, stretched taut and strong as gazelles leap, butterflies dip and sway. As hummingbirds' wings spin, I was born to dance. Raised at a ballet bar, cabrioles and développés, carved legs that defied gravity, chest lifted, arms rounded, muscles groaning, shrieking, heartbeat throbbing, I soared to thunderous applause. But from revered heights to catastrophic low, I was herded into a stock car that chugged towards a misery I was unprepared to face in a base labor camp bereft of music, of beauty. Artists, communists, Jews, gypsies were packed together. Desperate, they ripped away the wagon window's wire cage. And I, chest lifted, arms rounded, heartbeat throbbing, leapt one last time. Another one of the pieces of history that I didn't know, and oftentimes I would have to go do research and look up the history after the poems, was the fact that a number of families who lived in Lodz, L-O-D-Z, am I saying it correctly? In order to escape, moved into the sewer system. Whole families lived for years in the sewer underneath the city. And this is the story of Eva, and she broke my heart, but I also had great respect for her and her family in trying to survive in the worst situations possible. She was 6. Once upon a time, there was a fat rat named Lech. He bit off Gittle's tail. She wouldn't let him snuggle. Sometimes they let me pet them when they wanted my bread. Papa said, "Don't share. There's not enough for us, let alone the rats." The sanitation workers dropped food through the sewer holes, and we waited in the cold for the war to end. I played with the rats and tried to keep my feet dry, and sometimes I wondered what the ghetto looked like now. I tried to remember how the sun felt on the back of my neck, and how flowers smelled, and what wind whispers in your ear. Mama's baby was born. It went to heaven, and one day Lech bit me, and I went to join the baby and God. The end. Bathed in glowing light through a tunnel dark and deep, a triumphant cry, victory, I have arrived. The most beautiful face in the world, a butterfly kiss, a croon, hush, love, hush. A bosom soft and sweet, shut it up, make it stop, someone will hear. Weathered hands on fragile skin, then back into the angel's arms. So, one of the things that happened during the war was, she says, looking for the page, one of the things that happened was there was a whole group of women who were kept captive in the Warsaw Ghetto. Rather than be captured, they would hide grenades beneath their dresses, and when captured, they would pull the grenade and they would take out the soldiers around them. Nicholas says, and again, think of these as humans. These are the people that you went to school with. These are the people who live next door to you. They have their own ways of coming to these stories. He says she had the tongue of an asp that stung an agonizing wound, and the face of a sewer rat, with teeth rabidly ready to inflict writhing convulsions. She drove my father's lips to the bottle and his body to the village whore. In me, she planted such a putrid seed of hate for the stench of female that I turned forever the other way. How ironic, then, that I should die face to face with a halcyon she-devil who licked taunting slug lips that curved in a feline grin, captured but not resigned, secreted beneath her clothes. She pulled the pin on a grenade, and together we met our fate. And this is what Joanne had to say to that. And you gotta love her. She says, Hattushep, 15th century BC, Queen of Egypt. Nefertiti, 14th century Queen of Egypt. Samuramat, 9th century BC, Assyrian Queen. Cleopatra, 69 to 30 BC, Queen of Egypt. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of England and France. Here we go, Joan of Arc, leader of the French army. Isabella de Castile, Queen of Spain. Catherine de Massini, Queen of France. Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth the First. Amina, 1560 to 1610, Nigerian Queen. Nazing Gombala, Angolian Queen, 1582 to 1663. Catherine the Great, 1729 to 96, Empress of Russia. Victoria, 1818 to 1901, Queen of England. Zhu Xi, 1835 to 1908, Empress of China. Leo Kalani, last monarch of Hawaii. Joanna Stein, 1922 to 1942, Halutz. And then all together, ladies and gentlemen, she said this, ha, females, the weaker sex, no way. This lovely lady was deaf, and I'm not going to read her poem to you. She was deaf, and they being Hitler, decided to seal her womb so that her deaf genes would not pollute the rest of the German nation. This last poem here is Stacy Oppenheimer, and she was a very young girl in the concentration camps. And you're going to recognize who she was talking about. And this is what she has to say. We are born to die, and no great tragedy in that. For no flame burns forever, and most shed so little light that those beyond its immediate pool scarce notice when the insignificant thing is snuffed. But when one who is born with exceptional talent and promise is removed before fulfilling her destiny, that then is truly tragic. So while I did not lament my fate, I fretted mightily over my friend Anne's. I prayed she would live to see the war's end, live to write our stories so the world might hear and remember the deeds of evil men and how we suffered at their hands, but more so how we fought fear and despair to the end, clinging to hope and to each other as we strove to believe in the ultimate power of good over evil. was done with the poems, I told you, I started to create artwork, and the artwork is rather interesting because partially I wasn't a good artist, and partially because there were so many different mediums and so many different styles. So this one, I'm going to go briefly through the artwork. This one illustrated a story of a little British boy, and he was caught up in the bombing of Britain, and he hid under his bed. And he was saying, it sounded like monsters booming and banging, and my mama was screaming, Timmy, come out. Timmy, come out. And he says, but I was never going to. Nope, not never. And so that is his story, not never. The next one in the artwork is Vera. Vera was actually a young woman in a tiny town. The Germans came, these gorgeous officers came, and they wined her and dined her, and they gave her chocolates, and she was caught up in it, man. She thought it was fabulous. And until the other villagers tied her hair to the tail of a horse and dragged her through the town. Victoria was cute. The way she spoke to me was cute. She said that when the soldiers came, her mother put her in her best Shabbat dress, and when the soldiers took them all outside, she wasn't the least bit scared, because she knew not even a bad soldier could hurt such a pretty dress. These are some of my favorites. They're the gossiping women of the village, and I'm not going to read it, but I am going to tell you about it. So these are the women, the gossiping women in one of the villages. And, media not found. That's odd, isn't it? Okay, here's what the media was supposed to be. Bok, 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 bok. Now, I think of them as my chicken ladies. And they're all gossiping about, did you hear this? Did you hear that? Did you hear that the Jews are doing this? Did you hear that they're sacrificing children? Did you hear that they're going to be picked up? And after every single line, they seem to go, amen. And they are made out of clay, as you can see. Louise Marr's story, her little boy says, you know, why didn't my parents do something when we were taken away? And she says, well, the waters rose and rose, and those who weren't invited upon the ark were left holding their children's hands, and there was nothing they could do. Nothing. Another subgroup of the civil society that Hitler and his cronies targeted were homosexuals. This was the story of a young homosexual man and how he felt he was being targeted in his village. Christine Solomon was the village whore, and all the women despised her for entertaining their husbands. And she says that she was the only one who secretly took in Jews and hid them in her basement and fed them. And she says, in the end, I'm the only one who's going to walk through heaven's gates. Judah Berkowitz was a rabbi who talked about how he knew what was going on, but he just couldn't believe it. That he couldn't believe that once again, the Jews were going to be the targets of annihilation, and he didn't want to scare his congregants. So instead of telling them what he knew, he kept it a secret. And he lives and he died knowing that he had failed them and perhaps failed God. Adonai. Caroline was a little girl. She and her twin sister were used in medical experimentations. Her mother said when they got to Auschwitz that she would see them at the gates. They looked for her for a full year, and she was never at the gates of Auschwitz, but she didn't lie. When they passed, there she was, saying, I told you I'd be here, my darlings. A Catholic priest who was incarcerated in a concentration camp, there was a man who escaped, and the Nazis said that they were going to shoot 5 people in order to punish the escapee, and 5 priests stepped forward and said, "No, me." And this was a young priest who was praying, he told me, for a way to prove his faith to God. And in that moment, when he had the opportunity to prove the depth of his faith, he couldn't do it. He couldn't step forward. He was too frightened. This one I am going to read because she's one of my very favorites, and her name's Hilda Wolf. She was a resistance fighter, and she's delicious. You'll like her. Behind my tiny, tidy house, within the picket fenced-in yard, beneath the rich and fertile soil, I planted many lovely things like turnips, onions, carbine rifles, oiled pouches filled with maps, a bin of vouchers to buy food for hungry, frightened, hidden Jews. Behind my crepey, wrinkled face, beneath my white-haired, tidy bun, inside my nodding, bobbing head, I stored the many facts I heard when soldiers' mouths began to wag, not guessing that a sweet-faced crone would understand the plans they made and hand them on to Allied knights. Behind my lovely little house, within my spare and lonely room, behind my bony, blue-veined hand, I giggled like a teenage girl at all the strutting, silly fools who think the biggest, brightest box is sure to hold the diamond ring, and covers tell a volume's worth. Isn't she lovely? You gotta love that woman. A young German who says that he died too soon, that he wanted to make the headlines. This piece was actually made out of torn pieces of World War II newspapers, and they were woven, they were burned, they were stained with charcoal and mounted. Towards the end of the war, there was a town called Dresden, and it was really where a lot of refugees ended up, and it was known as a center for the arts. And the British, just having too many bombs, decided to bomb Dresden. It created a whirlwind of flames, and the few survivors said they saw the circus horses pull free from their tethers and go racing through the flames. This piece is made of glass and ceramic. This young lady, Sarah, was defiant. She talked about having red ribbons around her concentration camp gown and in her hair, and how finally her shoes wore through. And the ribbons climbed her legs until her body was consumed in temperature, in a fever, and she was set free. And this was a poem about how the Jews were constantly ousted from one place to another, and they thought they had found a permanent home, and that was not to be. And I will read you this one because I love her. She, I think a lot of us know her, or are her. Towards the end of the war, the Germans went into Russia because they had depleted their whole workforce. They went into Russia and they started snatching people up as they came out of movie theaters or church, and they would take them back to Germany to work in the factories. They would work them to death, and their people never knew what happened to them. So this is her story. No one noticed the shadow child who hid beneath the stairs to read and watched the shining gifted ones exchange their birthday party talk or chat about the games they played at get-togethers after school, while her heart cried out, "I'm here, I'm here." Were you one of those people, or did you know one who went through school and nobody even noticed you. And your heart broke because you wanted so badly to be part of the in-group, and you weren't. No one noticed the mousy teen who viewed the world from downcast eyes. She longed for boys with cocky grins and envied girls with flowing hair. She ached to join their weekend plans and laughing talk of who likes who, while her heart cried out, "I'm here, I'm here." No one noticed the silent woman who slid through days so calm and still that when the Nazis plucked her up and worked her hard, then put her down, the world went on without a hitch and no one said, "Where did she go?" Still her heart cries out, "I'm here, I'm here." We're almost done, hang in there with me. The third part of the War Cries saga was that after the book got out there, professional actors from around the country, in fact around the world, started using their iPhones to photograph themselves doing their interpretations of poems that they selected. So I have a few here. Scott is an actor in New Mexico. He works all over the country. He was one of the first ones to contact me.
They told me I was different, and I listened. They told me to wear a star, so I stitched. They told me to pack, so I gathered my things. They told me to move, so I walked. They told me to stay, so the ghetto became home. They told me there was no food, so I starved. They told me to leave, so I left. They told me to flee, so I ran. Bang! They told me to die, so I slept.
This next one is a young actress who is winning awards all over the country at this point, and her mother is a professional opera singer, Annalisa. She's 15 years old.
From the body of this child, another child strained to emerge. But I, only 12, couldn't. I tried, but oh God, I just couldn't allow him passage. Blood flowed from my womb to stain snowy sheets. I mewed and wailed, crying out, "Mama, help!" But she could do nothing but stroke my brow and croon a soothing lullaby as I left this world, taking my baby soldier with me. In this I failed my Führer.
Oftentimes when people arrived at concentration camps, they got separated from their families in either the chaos or in a determined way. And this woman, Elizabeth Stern, had that experience.
What a terrible decision. What a seemingly impossible decision. But the little boy's sobs tore me from my daughter's side, and I scooped up the wailing toddler, holding him to my shoulder and soothing him with whispers. And when the sorting came, my daughter, almost a woman, was chosen to live on, while those of us with children were herded towards the gas chambers. "Is that your baby?" a soldier demanded. And I looked over the tiny head into my lovely daughter's eyes, and we said goodbye. For how could I allow a child to walk into death's arms alone? There was no decision to be made. There was no decision at all.
They tell of the suffering of Untermenschen. With quivering lips, indignation, fury, they clutch breasts and shake heads while speaking of monsters in our midst. But do they tell of the German people's suffering, the starvation, the loss of jobs and land? Do they tell of the dishonest Jews that caused the plague of misery and death that descended on our country after the First War? Is it no wonder that as a beaten dog, driven mad by hunger and pain, will turn on its tormentor, we turned on the Jews? They tell of the suffering of Untermenschen, with quivering lips, indignation, fury. They make me sick.
In the end, this is the takeaway, I hope, from War Cries. Then if any of you have questions, I'm way open to them. As I said, it did send me into therapy. It was the hardest thing that's ever happened to me. Some way, for some reason, I was chosen to tell their stories, and I take it as an honor and obligation. And I speak wherever I'm asked to speak, and I do not charge an honorarium. I would encourage all of you to pick up the book if you can. We'll be selling it. You've met about 20 of my voices, and there were 99 total, and people say, so why didn't you go on to 100, round it up? And I said, well, they stopped at 99, and I wasn't willing to make one up. So this, to me, though, is the takeaway. White rabbits can be drawn from hats and coins plucked from ears. Babies emerge wailing from wombs. The deathly ill can heal and rise from their beds. A flower often sprouts where it was never planted. The sound of the sea can be heard in a shell. A mountain returns your spoken words. Fog can be seen, but never touched. And the moon changes shape in the night sky. The world is full of magic, and so I allow myself to believe that somehow, some way, those who come after will sense my presence like a voice echoing through time. They will pause labors or pleasures and wonder, who? And as long as I reside in their minds and their hearts, I will never truly be gone.